Chapter 26. Butcher. I looked up from the forge when my mother stepped into the orange shadow cast onto the floor. I smiled, although I didn't straighten from my position bent over the edge of the copper disc. Welcome home. She sighed and stepped closer to glance at my project with indifference. You really have transitioned. I'm still in process. She nodded decidedly, like she'd made up her mind about something. I met your baker. I swallowed and bent my steel chisel to the symbol I was carving. How was that? She sighed. If he's Landry's son, he must be talented, but I wasn't impressed with his manners. I laughed under my breath, sweat sliding down my forehead. He's an excellent baker. She laughed, a soft sound that reminded me of something a long time ago. She smoothed back my hair, her touch light and cool on my hot skin. And you are accustomed to Landry. No doubt Cesario is pleasant compared to your father's baker. Hopefully you'll keep him in line slightly better than your father manages Landry. I smiled wryly as I stared at the last constellation I was engraving along the edge. Orion the Hunter. If I knew how to manage Violetta, I still wouldn't know what to do with her. My mother was shifting my focus too much to concentrate on my work. I straightened up and put my tools away. Did you want to speak to me? She smiled. I haven't seen you for months and now you have your very own baker, even if he is. She shrugged her shoulders beneath the black coat that sculpted her body. It wasn't quite as functional as her real butcher coats, but she wasn't here to work. Well, not butchering. Thank you. I cleaned up my tools and covered the disc, the third one. I was going to put all 3 temporary seals on at the same time. Walk with me. We can throw some knives. I pulled my shirt on and followed her out of the cavernous space where ancient wills dangled stories above us. My time is limited. She only nodded. I'll be brief. I believe that it's time for you to marry. I choked on my own spit and earned a calm look from her. Marry? Perhaps. Eventually. On the solstice would be good luck. Being joined together on the longest night is a sign of strength and longevity. I do not have time to get married during this season of darkness. Her eyes narrowed. You wouldn't be required to do anything other than be present for the ceremony. I laughed. And what girl would be satisfied with such a sudden arrangement? She sighed softly. You have been betrothed to Olivia for many years. Surely. It is not very sudden. My mind spun at the idea of marriage to Olivia, beautiful girl after my own heart, but somehow nothing I could ever desire. Violetta. What would she think? If she heard my mother planning my wedding? She would ache but wouldn't say anything, just bake the most exquisite creations without demanding anything more than our butcher/baker relationship. Ever since Lance's disappearance, she hasn't wished to continue with our arrangement. I've almost forgotten about her. Her eyes widened in alarm. Certainly not. Her mother assures me that Olivia is a dutiful butcher who would be honored to serve as your wife. I almost groaned. Sometimes my mother's upbringing was embarrassingly medieval. I'm afraid that I could not serve as her husband. I have no feelings for Olivia. She waved an elegant hand as if to brush away my objection. Olivia would be ideal, but if you prefer another girl from a good family, I have no objection. This was her being magnanimous. Honestly, I hadn't expected her to fold on the Olivia thing so easily. It made me suspicious. Mother, I couldn't possibly find a girl to marry in such a short amount of time. Maybe next year. She frowned at me, the expression puzzled and hurt. Orion, you aren't forgetting your duty, are you? I inhaled deeply. My duty? I was staying away from Violetta out of duty. No, I wasn't forgetting my duty, but I wasn't going to marry another girl while the scent of Violetta's skin came over me and I couldn't focus, think, do anything else until the memory passed. It wouldn't be fair to the most ambitious and dutiful butcher girl in the world. Mother, I am still transitioning. I lack the balance to add one more thing to my juggling routine. So many changes have happened so quickly, this butcher, vampire kidnapping, bakers, threatening civil war, along with the shifts of allies and monsters, my position and instincts, my connection to my baker. It's enough for 1 year. She studied me for a long time. I'm afraid that if you allow your connection to your baker to deepen, you won't be able to connect well with your wife. That wouldn't be an issue if my baker were my wife. I swallowed as I remembered her waking up in my bed. She'd gotten almost clinical in her taking of my energy recently, Could she sleep with me without taking my energy? Only we could find out. What excuse could I use to conduct that experiment? No, I shouldn't think about sleeping with her in my arms, holding her as I slept, so whatever nightmares I had, whatever visions I suffered, I would wake up to her. I realized I hadn't answered her and she was studying me. My father's connection with Landry is enviable. The entire district profits from their collaboration. She sighed and looked off in the distance. Yes, that is true. I had hoped for more in my son's marriage, but duty comes first. She studied me for a few more moments before she nodded. I will make inquiries into which charming young lady would enjoy an attachment even on such short notice. Mother, I am not prepared for marriage. She put a hand on my arm. I understand. You must concentrate on your duties, while I worry about these trivial matters. Marriage isn't trivial, Mother. I will not marry a random girl, however excellent her background and however little she minds last-minute arrangements. She raised her eyebrows. Are you well? Your voice rose. I smiled. My voice rose for emphasis. I am very well, particularly well. Occupied. Even showing up for a solstice ceremony is too much this year. She nodded. We will arrange the contract which you can sign. You don't need to actually be present. I almost sighed, but she would read too much into that. She would marry me away without me even being there. She'd given up too quickly on Olivia, so she must have heard something about our break, but that she pushed marriage this quickly and this persistently. Maybe she heard something else as well. It seems like you've thought of everything. However, I'm not going to marry a girl I don't like. You would refuse your duty? If my duty required me to marry someone I didn't know or like, then yes, I would refuse my duty. Happily, duty gives us options that we can live with. You do not dislike my father, I believe. Her expression cleared. Your father is completely acceptable. He was the ideal butcher and is now the ideal CM. As you are the perfect butcher. I am grateful to have two such perfect examples of perfect duty. My duty calls me somewhere other than a marriage ceremony to a nice butcher's daughter on the solstice. She hesitated only for a moment. Is there another? I threw a knife and it spun before landing precisely in the center of the target. There was Olivia. Always. Now I need time to adapt to the idea of a new life mate. If you love Olivia, I'm certain we can work things out for you. I shook my head as I walked up to the target, removing my blades before I returned to her. I do not love Olivia. I never did. I believe that was the problem. I was more the butcher than I was her love. She made its sking sound. She's a fool if she thinks that passion is more valuable than stability than character. I wish you to marry this winter. My aunt read your fortune. Oh great. Just what I needed, one of my mystical great-aunt's fortunes. They lack consistency. She pulled out two knives and threw them unerringly into the center of the target. If you do not have a wife by 12th night, dire consequences will occur. She turned towards me and for a moment touched my face. I worry that I will lose you, Orion, as I lost your brother. I cannot lose you as well. I wanted to say that she hadn't lost Armand. He was living in filth downtown. But instead I only smiled stiffly. I am too large to lose easily. She smiled and backed up. I've taken too much of your time. Think on it. Orion, if there is a girl who you wouldn't be adverse to taking as your wife, I will think about it. I would think about the only girl in the world I could ever take as anything, but my mother would never approve of her. She would lose me as much as she'd lost Armand. A few days later, I was down in the cavern of seals, stalagmites dripping mind-numbingly while Armand and Sebastian warmed up their violins. Valchiari had accompanied us, but she didn't seem entirely happy about it. Butcher, she said in a low voice, this will stir creatures from the deeps. I raised my eyebrows as I finished etching my circles into the stones, the signs of Taurus the bull before Orion the hunter. This went well. The second set of permanent seals would cover these without the slightest gapping. I would like you to soothe them. As you like. Do you know what you're doing? No idea, I said reassuringly. Let's get this party started. I unwrapped the 2.5-foot gouger, flipped on the ear-shattering motor and held it to the stone until the enormous diamond bit caught in the rough rock where I'd attached the placement bolts. Sebastian froze and looked up like he'd heard a rumble. I determined not to hear anything since thinking about being crushed by thousands of tons of Stones wouldn't put me in the proper meditative state required for mystical CM processes. Orion, I think it's time I took you to a real party, no offense. I grinned at Sebastian. None taken. I've never been to as much as a birthday party. Armand raised an eyebrow. You should come to a werewolf rave, bring vanilla with you. I stiffened up. Should I? All those werewolf teeth and my sweet Violetta's skin. Voltaire cleared her throat. You are welcome to join us in our revelries, although the refreshments might not be to your taste. Thank you, Voltaire. I appreciate the offer. She smiled at me demurely, demure for an ancient vampire who smelled like old blood with skin like parchment paper. Armand and Sebastian struck up the first notes. I thought that your baker would be here. Why? I yelled over the gouger and the sound of my brother and Sebastian playing. I was on the second bolt hole. Only 2 more to go for this set. She pointed at me. The hunter, Orion, pointed at Armand. Canis the dog. Then at Sebastian, Taurus the bull, but without the baker, no Gemini, no twins. I thought about that while I gouged out the second to last hole. If everything was perfectly safe after our temporary seals had held for long enough, I might bring Violetta down here, ask her to donate a drop or 2 of blood to activate the seals along with Sebastian and Armand. And Voltaire. She was the sextant, the compass of her people. Perhaps on 12th night. She nodded and kicked me, sending me back 10 feet along with my equipment. Was on my feet and heading back when an enormous tentacle whipped out of the hole and swiped where I'd been before, withdrawing back down. Thank you, I said before setting back to work on the last hole. Think nothing of it, she said with another demure smile. The next time she kicked me back, I was ahead of her, jumping back before the slimy tentacle could grasp me. I almost stabbed it, but she held my arm back, shaking her head. The Kraken is only curious now. It will be much more aggressive if angry. You have work to do still, do you not? Sing to the Kraken, Armand said, laughing, his notes careening wildly off the cavern walls. I sang as loudly as I could while gouging out the second to last hole. This was taking too long. I dodged the next time the tentacles whipped around. Glimpse of a suction cup the size of my face, making my stomach queasy. This monster was very large. I began on the last hole while Sebastian and Armand played a very restful version of We Will Rock You, which, considering the venue, might not have been ideal for psychological reasons. Voltaire grabbed my hand and swung me while I leapt, bringing me back to the hole by the time the monster had retracted, but each time more tentacles had emerged. We were waking up deep things. How do you kill a kraken? I didn't happen to have a Medusa head handy, just a vampire, a werewolf, and a butcher. If Violetta were here, she could take the tentacles I chopped off and make a delicious barbecue for us. I had to leap back again but dropped the gouger, and a tentacle wrapped around it, dragging it back toward the hole. I threw a knife deep into the tentacle, which got it to release the tool but also to make a sound, a guttural popping, crunching, horrible sound that was the only warning before it exploded out of the hole in a mess of enormous tentacles and bulbous head filled with teeth, so many teeth. Wonderful. Armand and Sebastian played while the kraken attacked them, and Voltaire moved them from the path of the monster, almost as though she could see its movements before it made them. Excellent. She was moving the monster away from the hole, led by the horrible music, which was also a problem. Running away from a kraken around an enormous cavern wasn't ideal, but I still couldn't remember how to kill them, and more things were stirring below. Continued with the gouger, backing up every once in a while as a flurry of nightmares emerged and were immediately drawn to the violinists, who seemed appetizing to nightmares, or maybe I was still wearing that invisibility mantle. Orion, you're going to have to wrap that up. I nodded at Armand while I pushed against the gouger. That last inch wasn't giving very easily, almost like the stone knew what was coming next. Something was coming. Something big. The ground rocked and shook, and it wasn't the kraken. I saw something coming with burning eyes so filled with death, anguish, and horror that I knew I would die. Instead of dying, I threw the cap on and pounded it down with one enormous blow from the hammer I'd brought for the purpose. The bolts fused down, spikes shooting out into the rock triggered by the impact. A shock spread from that impact, or the beast beneath struggling to get free, but I grabbed my gouger and set to work on the second seal. Could feel its weakness, the pressure beneath that sought its freedom. The second temporary seal would be activated the moment the seal finally broke. which it would on midwinter's night, the solstice, the day my mother wanted me to get married. Would Violetta ever consider me after everything I'd done to her? I shook my head and focused on the drilling. I dodged the odd tentacle while Armand and Sebastian played and ran around the cavern, Voltaire pulling them out of the monster's reach or poking it with her enormous hatpin. I would have liked to watch with a bowl of popcorn, but the gouger took both hands. I worked until I finally had the holes ready, then set up the seal, ready for one blow to keep the monsters away. I started on the third one and noticed that the violin playing was really horrible. When I glanced over and saw Armand hitting the monster with his violin, I understood. At least he hadn't brought his good violin. Apparently he'd seen this coming. I smiled as I worked on the last seal, ready for one final blow before I turned and threw my knife into the tentacle holding Sebastian in the air, cutting it off. Sebastian fell, but the tentacle probably cushioned most of his landing. I grabbed him by the back of the coat and hauled him up, handing him 2 knives as I leapt forward to throw a poisoned powder onto some little mites that would gnaw through your flesh, then lit them on fire. They went off like little firecrackers, silver and blue bursts that smelled like burnt potatoes. I was hungry. We'd been down here for a long time. I had a funny idea and, after slicing off another tentacle, I leaped over the roiling limb and ran to the pile of equipment I'd brought. Yes, here it was, the old-fashioned bow I'd thrown into the pack on a whim. If I were Orion the hunter fighting a mythical beast, I should do it with a bow. I had no arrows, but I did have the gouger. I don't have to mention how terribly off the balance was or how sad it was to say goodbye to such a useful piece of equipment. I drew back the ancient bow that was somehow steel and elastic, and sent the gouger into the monster's enormous mouth, which was about to bite off Armand's head. It was a mess. Kraken brains flew about in a whir while it twitched and contorted, managing to hit Voltaire as it struggled mindlessly. Literally, the mines were all over my coat by the time we cleaned out the cavern of the other monsters released from the depths and headed for the entry. Surprisingly well done, Voltaire murmured. I apologize for the mess, I said and offered her a bow. She was covered in as much Kraken brain matter as the rest of us. She sniffed a bit on her sleeve and licked it. I looked away and stayed looking away while she exited, rising to the hole in the ceiling like an old vampire who can levitate does to make us all feel insufficient. I pulled out my grappling gun and shot into the ceiling, rising at a fast clip. To the hole I swung into upside down, then hauled up Sebastian and Armand, who had followed me. We closed the trapdoor and grinned at each other. At least I think Armand was smiling beneath the gunk on his face. He'd really gotten it full on. I headed towards Border Town. I'd stopped behind the building I usually hosed off at. Armand came with me and Sebastian like I was in charge or something. Not bad, Armand finally said, although you seemed distracted. I shrugged. I think it went much better than I expected. No one died and we destroyed a kraken. You don't do that every day. You did it, Sebastian said, sounding in awe. You're like a great hunter, bringing down the mythical beast. I glanced at him. The gouger worked very well. The bow is what worked, Armand corrected. You're Orion the hunter. I nodded and gripped the bow I still held. Felt extremely right in my hand. It's a good bow. I think I might make some arrows for it. Much better than 14th century muskets. Armand and I grinned at each other. My father's taste in weaponry always mystified me, but we're allowed our preferences, at least in weapons. My smile faded as I remembered my mother. When are you and Olivia getting married? Armand asked, to be annoying. Sebastian stiffened at the same time I sighed. Orion's not marrying Olivia. I mean, I kissed her for an hour today. Armand and I looked at Sebastian questioningly. He shifted uncertainly. She insisted. I was supposed to be doing paperwork, but she said it was an emergency. You try arguing with that woman, was his final defense. I shrugged. I would not waste my breath. It would be like arguing with my mother. Armand glanced at me sharply. I thought you looked tired. When's the date? The solstice would be a lucky time. He nodded. Lucky for her. I somehow doubt you'll wed a pretty little butcher maid, no matter how persistent she is. I swallowed. I cannot even think of it. I cannot breathe at the thought of touching another creature. I would rather become a werewolf. He raised an eyebrow. I never thought I'd hear you say that. For the record, No one is going to turn you, so you'd be better off throwing yourself in one of those holes and fighting Kraken for the rest of your much shortened existence. Good to know. I'm having doubts. About your doubts? I hesitated, then nodded. Good. You can't fight the demons, particularly the ones on the inside, without faith. How could I have faith in anything without Violetta? She'd been the one who had started my change, stirring my feelings until empathy was as alive as my aching desire. Desire. I could not marry another girl with the aim of having children, producing a new generation of butchers. I'd been aware that Olivia was beautiful, but desire hadn't ever been real until I tasted Violetta's cream puffs in her lips. How many days since I'd tasted her lips? Too many, not enough. Not if I wanted to forget her, but how could I forget when she was right in front of me? Even if I wasn't allowed to hold her, taste her, I could smell her and every once in a while brush her skin. She was stronger than me. She never cheated, touched me when it wasn't necessary. I found myself looking for every excuse to be close enough to smell her and brush her fingers. I shouldn't do it. I had to be strong or I'd fall into those mystic green pools and never Chapter 27. Baker. I answered my phone. Vanilla, meet us down by the pond. The Greek wants to take you shopping. Armand hung up, leaving me staring at the phone before I shrugged and tucked it into my apron. Who was that? Landry asked, his forearms enormous as he kneaded a pile of bread the size of my body. Armand. We're going out for a while. He nodded. Good. Get out before the mistress corners you again. She doesn't need to quiz you on your technique. Everyone knows it's terrible. I sighed. Thanks, Landry. He chuckled and I took off my apron, grabbed my coat and backpack, then headed outside, down the path and to the pond of purity. I stopped there beside a tree, staying safely away from the edge. I missed him so much. I saw him every day, but there was always distance and I ached from it. Maybe it would be easier to find another butcher, to find a different life. Good thing I didn't mind hard things. I adjusted my backpack and headed to the car as it came up the drive. Armand and the Greek were both in the car. I stared at it, trying to figure out logistics. When the Greek climbed into the back, I just sort of blinked a few times before I got into the passenger seat. You comfy back there? I asked, balancing the backpack on my knees. He patted my head, took off my hat and ran his fingers through my hair. There's plenty of room. We're going to get you a dress. I craned my neck to stare at him. A dress? I'm posing as a boy. He grinned at me hugely. But your brother happened to mention to Orion's mother that you exist, and she's hunting you down. She came to my shop 3 times looking for you. I tell you, gave me some serious indigestion. I need to buy some Tums. Remind me, Armand, to get some Tums. Get some Tums. He sighed. So helpful. What was I saying? She's been at the Vespetti's house and practically combing the streets looking for you in Border Town. She even bothered Armand a few times, which is mighty peculiar. She doesn't like Raff. Why is she looking for me? I mean Violetta? He shrugged and glanced at Armand. It seems like she tried to get Orion to marry a girl and he balked. She's suspicious that there's another girl. That's you, which is dead on. You have to admire her instincts. Like a bloodhound, Armand said in a flat tone. Wait, so Orion's mother wants to meet Violetta, so you think I should meet her wearing a dress? A ball gown? Backless? The color of your eyes? I felt all the blood leave my extremities. A ball gown? You think I should go to the Midwinter's Eve ball? As Violetta? Idiot Sebastian. No, absolutely not. She'll be able to tell that I'm the same person as Cesario. She's not stupid. No, but she lacks a sense of the ridiculous, Armand said, flashing his teeth at me in what was probably a smile. He had a big bruise on his neck in the shape of a saucer. What happened to your neck? Were you making out with an octopus? He raised his eyebrows. How did you know? If she doesn't meet Violetta soon, she'll start bothering you, Cesario. If you want peace in Candlestick, you'll give her a flash of Violetta that makes her realize that you aren't Orion's beloved. In fact, you're much more interested in disreputable former butchers than actual butchers, and put her suspicions behind her. I stared at him. I'm supposed to flirt with you? I can't flirt. I tried that already. He shook his head. No, you don't need to flirt, you just have to stand there smiling. The dress will do the talking, right, Greek? The Greek bobbed his head. Violetta, it's going to be wonderful. I have the perfect wig for you and the makeup. Everything's going to be so fun after all. That time you spent being Cesario. You're tired of it. I shrugged. I don't know. I didn't put on the boy clothes for Orion's mom but for him so he could have the distance that he needs so we can be detached. Don't want to undo that. Armand grinned. I think you do, at least a little bit. I stared at him, my heart pounding. Did I? Maybe a little teeny bit. Want Orion to look at me and not be able to look away, but that would undo the entire purpose of this, which was to prove that Orion didn't like me. I sighed. Fine. I'm not certain your arguments are rational, but what is in this world? Crazy butchers. I found myself the night of the ball working with Landry on sheets and sheets of rolls, desserts, and amazing confections that I could only dream of creating someday. He put his hand on my shoulder. I'm going to head to my cottage, watch some gymnastics on the telly. Would you care to join me? I stared at him. Was that a good enough excuse? I leaned close to him. I'm going to spend the night with my girlfriend. I pulled away and eyed him. He glanced towards the door even though there didn't seem to be anyone around. Are you? I heard a rumor that your sister Violetta is coming to the ball tonight. She could use your support. I snorted. Yeah? I suppose Sebastian said that. Idiot. Why wouldn't you want to support your sister? I knew that musical voice of Orion's mother far too well. I scowled and checked around for something to take out of the oven or dough to roll out. Something. I don't think that she should go to butcher gatherings. I get that. She's welcome, got the butcher/baker blood and whatnot, but she doesn't really belong here. She smiled at me, a lovely smile that only made me edge closer to Landry. Why? Do you think that? I shrugged and looked at Landry for an answer. He stared back at me, the question in his eyes like why didn't I think that Violetta belonged here when he did. I looked back at Orion's mother, frowning while I thought. She's too ordinary. She should go to school, work, date normal guys, go out with friends, live life. I have a baking compulsion so I'm kind of stuck. But she should try to enjoy herself, make the most of it. I chewed on my lip. Maybe I should make the most of it. I checked the time and jumped. Gotta go. Have a good night, Landry. Have fun watching those gymnasts. He patted my head kind of hard under my black hat. I think I'll go to the ball if she's going to be there. Maybe she'll give me a dance. I gave him a sidelong glance. Yeah, whatever. Later. I headed out the door. At a jog, running all the way to the Pond of Purity, but the little hatchback was already there, the Greek at the wheel. I got in the passenger's side and he took off, barely waiting until I closed the door. This is insane, I muttered. He grinned at me. A little bit. Armand's in a tuxedo. He let me cut his hair. And he looks almost handsome. Don't tell him I said that. It'll go to his head. He's waiting at the shop. Put on your hair and pull on the skirt and jacket. Orion's mother has someone watching the shop. I stared at him. Why? He shrugged. She thinks that you're the reason Orion won't marry someone else. He's 18. He's still in high school. Why would he marry anyone? There's no reason for it. That's just crazy. I pulled on the wig, adjusting the braids that were long enough to go down to my waist. This is long. He nodded. Yeah, and you're going to have to act different from Cesario, more girly. Girly? Fluffy sweater girly. More femme fatale girly if you can manage it. You're supposed to be the type of girl who likes almonds. I sighed. I really have no idea what kind of girl that would be. Not that I don't adore Armand, but he's like my kind of gross brother, He glanced at me, then back at the road while I pulled a skirt on over my pants, and then took the pants off underneath it. Nothing showed, but it was a little weird to get changed in the car beside the Greek. You really do have genuine affection for Armand and connection. If you can't turn that into something a little bit more for one night, you lack imagination. I snickered. Well, I can't have you thinking that I lack imagination. I got out at the shop and walked around in boots the Greek had provided, clomping with the untied laces to the back door where Armand waited, just inside, adjusting his cuffs every few seconds. Someone was watching the Greek's shop. I threw my arms around Armand's neck, dangling for a minute while I whispered in his ear. This is going to be really long night. Before I pulled away, smiled brilliantly and kissed his cheek. His cheek. The girl in the cage scorned, the same girl as the other two times, although she was the only one in there this time.
Is er daher?
Someone was watching, but I hadn't been thinking about the werewolf girl. I'm not really into PDA. I whirled around and pulled the Greek into the shop before I slammed the door. I was Violetta, alive, happy, brilliantly effusive and moving. You're letting a draft up my skirt. Eva. Got to get changed before Armand shreds his cuffs. Your dress is in the bathroom. I nodded and headed in, stopping for a moment to stare at the dress. Had I actually agreed to go out into public in a completely backless dress? The skirt was diaphanous with layers and layers of floating silk. I would look like one of those spring tulips, all green and feathery with bits of pink shot through it that would match the shoes. I got dressed and then sat in the front while the Greek fixed my makeup and my hair, the wig, and elaborate updo that made my neck look miles long, particularly in that dress. You need jewelry, Armand said when I got out of the chair and stared at the mirror stretched across the back wall. I shrugged. You have a diamond tiara in your back pocket? He snorted. How big do you think my pockets are? I smiled at him and spun around in the dress, my bare feet on the floor. Bigger than mine. What kind of a girl do you like, and what kind of girls like you? He stared at me for a long time, his face expressionless. Finally he said, Oh, that was an actual question, not just a joke? Girls. I stared at him. Are you actually into the Greek? The Greek laughed, throwing his head back while he bawled from laughter, large tears rolling down his cheeks. Oh, Violetta. You are so adorable. Think you should just be yourself tonight. Whether Armand likes you or you like him. Enjoy yourself. Okay. What car are we taking? Armand shifted. Motorbike. It'll make an impression. I stared at him. Certainly would. Okay. We should get on that then. In heels. Wear your boots in my jacket, my cool motorbike one, and carry your heels. You can leave your boots with the bike. I don't think it'll rain. I looked out the window. It's already snowing. See? No rain. Armand, you want to ride a motorbike in the snow? He growled a little. Yes, Vanilla. Do you want me to get you a limo instead? I shifted. He shouldn't get angry at me for wanting to be safe. No, the bike is fine. You drive like an old man. I like the way you drive. I feel safe. And as Violetta, I can hang on to you so I won't fall off. What about my hair? Can't have helmet hair. Armand grabbed my wrist and dragged me out of the shop, throwing my coat and boots at me, so I struggled to put them on with one hand while he kept hauling me. I did not like that. What girl would like being manhandled like that? He didn't usually act like this. Oh, he was putting on a show for the spy. Well, it was not a good show. I threw one of my boots at the back of his head. He stopped and whirled around, scowling at me. I stopped and put my boot on properly along with my coat and held out my hands for him to throw my boot back at me. Instead of doing that, he stalked towards me, dropped to his knees, and put my boot on for me. It was kind of chivalrous and sweet, particularly since he didn't sniff my foot or anything weird, and his hands were warm. Was going to freeze to death on the back of his bike in that dress, my legs bared to the world. At Candlestick Manor, I hopped off the bike, laughing and stomping my feet to get warm. Armand walked with me up the drive past the other parked cars to the door. The entry was beautiful lights and evergreen boughs with a sprig of mistletoe that I quickly dodged in case Armand was feeling traditional. He glanced up and then, giving me a sly smile, grabbed my hand and kissed my knuckles. Mistletoe. I've never seen that at Candlestick before. I wonder who had a hand in the decor. I shrugged as I stared at the Advent, my beautiful Advent that now looked happily surrounded by a spectacle of holiday cheer. Most of the gingerbread boxes were gone by now. Christmas would be soon, and I hadn't really got anything for Orion. Your brother does good work, Armand said, giving his and my coat and boots to the butcher's boys who were lined up for that kind of thing. He offered me his arm. I took it and walked with him, looking around at the draped and lit walls, up the stairs that curved gently and then widened and widened into a large room, much larger than the dining room we'd had the feast in. This room was enormous, like the gym, but much prettier, with a wood floor and a jazz band playing beautiful and amazing Christmas song renditions. There were more people than I'd ever seen in Candlestick, and the strange part was all the women. I wasn't used to seeing anyone besides butchers, but these women were much softer looking, happy and human. Several of the girls from my own girls' school, in fact the pastel girls, were all in a huddle whispering to each other and casting glances across the room at the black-clothed figure who wore his tuxedo like a straitjacket. He would have his cuffs as shredded as Armand. I couldn't help but smile when I saw him, and for a moment our eyes met and he smiled back. That moment set my heart racing, and my legs, which had been freezing a moment before, suddenly didn't mind so much. I turned towards Armand, my hands trembling as I tried to focus on him, to be the girl who liked scruffy better than perfect. Now what? I asked. He gestured towards the room. There's dancing, dining, talking, more dancing. Take your pick. Are you going to stay with me? I asked, feeling a flutter of nerves. He glanced past me, searching the faces before he nodded, short and no. Nonsense. I wouldn't throw you to the wolves like that. Let's find something to eat. It's always good to have something in your hands at a party. So you feel occupied? So you have a toothpick in case a vampire attacks? I shook my head. It was garlic infused. I think for my first vampire I wasn't that bad. He snickered. You were adorable, a sweet little ball of fluff going in for the kill. I frowned at him. You have no idea unless you watch the whole thing. Laughing your head off. His smile widened. No, I wouldn't stand back and let you fight off a vampire by yourself. I'd lend you at least a couple of silver dollars. What would I do with silver dollars? No idea, but I'm sure it would be hilarious. Ahem. I turned and saw a grinning Francis behind me. I smiled back at him. Hi, Francis. Violetta. I haven't seen you in quite some time. Would you care to dance? He held out his arm and I glanced at Armand for guidance, but he only shrugged. I'll be near the food. I put my hand on his arm and then his hand was covering mine, warm and alive, with flickering energy that asked me to take it. I didn't. I'd gotten very good at taking only as much energy as I wanted, even with Orion, who was ridiculously tempting, bordering on addictive. Francis pulled me into the waltz and pulled me close to him to whisper in my ear. I take it that this whole thing is for Mrs. Daughtry. She's been stalking you. I threw my head back and laughed merrily like he'd said the funniest thing. That's so true, I answered loudly. You're a really great dancer, Francis. Do you do these things a lot? You should have a girlfriend or something. Do you want me to introduce you to some of the girls from my school? Bastel. Girls are a lot of fun. He glanced around and then shook his head. Orion's staring at you. Isn't he supposed to be acting like he doesn't like you? I swallowed and bit my bottom lip, but somehow managed not to look at Orion, to not drink him in with my eyes. That's what he said. Do I look ridiculous? His eyes widened. Ridiculous? No. You look ethereal, magic, very lovely. Don't tell anyone I said that. I raised my eyebrows. I won't. Thanks, Francis. I've gotten very comfortable being Cesario. He frowned thoughtfully while he spun me around. When I'd come back to face him, he grinned. Forget about Cesario and everything else. I'm an extremely handsome butcher, and this song is all about us. He wiggled his eyebrows at me, but he didn't press his energy into me or even put his hand on my bare back. I focused on the dancing, and when it finally came to an end, I thanked Francis, turned and stopped abruptly in front of Orion's mother. Oh. I glanced at Francis and he winced before edging away. He was not going to rescue me. Well, this was what I was here for, to satisfy her curiosity. I blew Francis a kiss before I started walking off, but Orion's mother grabbed my wrist. Excuse me, but I don't believe we've met. I turned to the beautiful woman and smiled at her coolly. You're Mrs. Daughtry. Your reputation precedes you. I understand you've been looking for me. Well, I'm here. What do you want? I almost gasped after I said that, because I wasn't usually so rude to authority figures. Apparently Violetta was. She smiled slightly and let go of my wrist. Good, because I almost sucked the life out of her. That definitely wouldn't be polite. Tell me what your relationship is with my son. I followed her gaze to the side where Orion stood beside the CM, motionless, while he watched our exchange, really staring completely openly, which he shouldn't be doing if he was trying to show how we weren't together. I scowled at him and shook my head, but he kept staring. I sighed and turned a bright smile at Mrs. Daughtry. To be honest, I have no idea. He's going through some kind of transition thing. I mostly know him through my brother Sebastian, you know, the baby butcher. Isn't he adorable? Anyway, I'd say we were friends, but barely more than acquaintances. Anything else? She grabbed my arm again, this time higher, right below my bite mark. And this? Who did this to you? I cocked my head and smiled at her, but it wasn't a good smile. It was a smile that held back all the stress and trying over the last few months. I was his baker. No one had mentioned how taboo and inappropriate it was to kiss my butcher until I'd already gotten addicted to it. Your son bit me. Your beautiful, perfect, ideal butcher decided that I'd be more delicious than my brother Cesario's cream puffs. Any other questions? Her face went paler than it already was, and her lips trembled while something awoke in her eyes. Fury. Maybe I should have stuck with me being crazy about Armand. I looked over and saw him coming towards us fast. Would he make it before she'd ripped off my head? She followed my gaze and inhaled sharply while her fingers dug into my skin. She reminded me a little bit of that lovely vampire encounter, but I didn't have any toothpicks handy. Vanilla, you owe me a dance. Mother. Armand covered her hand with his and she flinched away from his touch, mouth curling in disgust and something else. Horrible grief that shook me. She wasn't supposed to be able to feel, so why was she struggling with so much pain? Armand took me away, my limbs numb and stupid. He pulled me into his arms and I fell against his chest, my heart beating rapidly. He danced me away from her in a swirl of other bodies that hit me from her furious gaze. After a few minutes I looked up at him. Mother. He'd called her his mother. She's your mother? Orion said that his brother is dead. He flinched. Yeah, I am as far as the butchers are concerned. Too bad other pieces of me are left to remind them of my failure. I turned to search the crowd for Orion. He stood by the CM straining towards me, the CM's hand on his arm. He was going to come and take me away from all of this. He was going to sweep me away and make certain no one, including his mother, ever touched me again. I turned back towards Armand, my heart aching and my brain struggling to make connections. Orion would never hate you for no cause. He nodded. No, I did the unpardonable. What, did you bite a baker? He grinned at me but didn't look at my bite mark. Don't give me ideas. Vanilla. No, I didn't do the biting. I frowned and shook my head. I don't understand. Something to do with Olivia's brother, something terrible. He growled. Let's go. We've done our damage here. It didn't look like you convinced her that you weren't interested in Orion. I winced. I told her that he bit me. I bragged about it. What's wrong with me? He pulled me tighter, his palm brushing the skin of my back. I leaned against him, soaking in his warmth and pulling in his strength. I needed strength. Needed so much, but I couldn't take Orion, couldn't say anything when he'd decided that he didn't need me. I pressed my cheek against his neck and pulled the strength into me, drawing it deeper and deeper from beneath the surface, letting the spark strike me, flickering inside of me like pain. He made a sound deep in his throat and then he was ripped away from me, Orion, punching his face and grabbing my hand, pulling me into his arms and spinning away with me. I was so dizzy, so incredibly dizzy, his hand sliding up my back, the connection more than energy, but him, his skin and touch, everything I'd ever ached for. For a moment I swayed towards him, but then I yanked my hand out of his and stepped away from him. I am not a piece of meat that you and your brother can fight over. He stared at me, his chest rising and falling, but everything else so still. He told you and you still let him touch you like that? I crossed my arms and hissed at him. You're making a scene. The whole point of this was so that you could show that you aren't still stupid about me, that we never really had a thing. Do something normal. He blinked and shook his head like he was trying to clear it. You want me to do something normal? Fine. He stood up straight and said in a clear voice, you shouldn't let that monster touch you. It isn't safe. As a member of my district, your safety is my responsibility. I stared at him and ran a hand over my knotted stomach, the pale green silk, shot with pink, so pretty, so soft, so delicious, but he could resist me. Of course he could. No, my parents' safety was your responsibility. The monsters are the ones who do nothing because they're paralyzed by indecision or whatever it was that kept you from doing your duty. Your brother is my butcher. I don't care what you think your district is or what you think your authority is over me and the monsters who know how to love me. His energy runs through me and I'm going to bake for him something you will never taste. I turned and walked away, not breathing because otherwise I'd scream or burst into tears, and I did not have time for those kinds of feminine emotions. The people parted before me like I was a pariah. Well, yeah, telling off the Butcher, son of the CM and whatever the crap he was turning into, that made me as much a monster as Armand. Awesome. I walked away from that mess and through the hall, heading away from the crowds into the quiet part of the manor, then climbed the stairs up to the tower where Orion's room was. I locked the door and threw myself on the bed, staring at the cross above me. If he hadn't wanted me before, he certainly wouldn't want me now. Well, good. I wrenched off a heel and threw it across the room and into his knife wall. Got stuck there tangled in blades so ridiculously pretty and pink compared to the other implements of death. I wanted to have a nice little fit, but seriously, that wasn't me. Yeah, felt things too much to contain, but screaming wouldn't help. I needed to bake, and to do that I'd have to change my clothes. I ripped off the wig, scrubbed off the makeup and unzipped the dress, letting it fall to the floor. In one delicious swish, I got dressed in my uniform, billowy white shirt, soft cotton buttoning up. Quickly rolled my sleeves and pulled on my black pants, tucking in the shirt and pulling the suspenders over my shoulders, shoes, socks, but I'd left the hat at the Greeks. Dang. I shrugged because I didn't really care. I was baking for me, well, for Armand, because he was the one I'd sucked so much energy out of more than ever before. Chapter 28. Butcher. After she left, I stood there staring after her for a long time until Sebastian came and put a hand on my shoulder. She's pissed. It's best to give her some space for a little while. I turned and stared at him. I messed up. He nodded and took a bite out of a roll. He was so different from Violetta physically, but they had the same eyes. Don't worry. She's used to guys messing up. I can attest to that. She told my mother that I bit her. He whistled. Yeah? I take it she didn't like that much. No, she didn't. Sebastian shrugged again. Why did you freak out about Armand? They were just dancing. He's been close to her for months. For a werewolf, he's not as dangerous as I'd expected him to be. He was about to bite her. He was going to mark her, drag her away, make her his mate to protect and keep. My voice was remarkably calm for the anger I still felt, the helpless fury. He only looked confused. Seems like weird timing for him to lose it. Did you see the energy she took from him? She was pulling out his butcher energy and leaving him with the wolf in a crowd of the enemy. He's always struggled with his urges, but her in that dress, taking so much from him, holding him like she needed him, it was too much. That dress, I have to agree, makes me blush to think about it. My sister should not wear that kind of thing with all these butchers drooling over her. What was that? Landry spat, coming up in half a tuxedo, wearing the jacket anyway over a t-shirt and jeans. Landry. I was going to dance with her. I got dressed up. I gave him a flat glare. Clearly. Look, Landry, I'm not in the mood to coddle. You? No? You bit Violetta and then told her you don't want her? Fine. Don't coddle me. He punched me then, which was a surprise. It also hurt because he sucked the life out of me in that touch and left me reeling, crouched down while the band played on even louder than before. This ball would be the source of excellent gossip for years to come. I couldn't hit my father's baker anymore. Then I could hit Violetta's father. I dodged and ducked away from his punches, while he advanced until Sebastian put a large hand on his chest. Hang on. Why are you hitting Orion? Landry stared at Sebastian, wearing identical scowls, minus the obvious differences in coloring. She's my daughter. Sebastian's face went slack and he stumbled back. That's impossible. Yes, the gossip would last for centuries. Landry, Orion, Sebastian, maybe we could take this conversation out of the ballroom. I turned to stare at my father, the CM. My mother stood behind his shoulder, her eyes staring at me with something a lot like betrayal in them. I'd disappointed her. For a second the fear that she wouldn't love me swept over me, but I shrugged it off, literally shrugging. I couldn't be who she wanted me to be. I have no problem with that. Landry, I asked, turning to him. He threw his hands in the air and turned, heading through the crowd like an irritated baker. I followed and Sebastian fell in beside me. He leaned over and whispered, Landry's crazy. He's not really my dad, just because we have the same eyes. Landry is crazy, but I'm afraid it's true. I gave him a sidelong glance. You're a much better butcher than he is. He scowled and shook his head. So that's why he was so nice to Vi. At least, he's not a creepy predator. He wasn't as nice to me. He was always sucking the life out of me. I shrugged. The more they take, the more they give you back, and the more you have in return. It's a good thing. Yeah? You like it when your baker sucks the life out of you, butcher. Sebastian, my father said in a low voice that still made Sebastian jump. I'm listening to your conversation. My mother was listening as well. Of course she was. We were out of the ballroom, halfway to the gymnasium where apparently Landry was leading us, when Candlestick Manor shuddered, plaster raining down while the walls trembled. We all crouched down, drawing weapons you usually didn't see with tuxedos. Back to the ballroom, my father ordered, turning to run back the way we'd come. I followed, but my mother held me back, Landry and Sebastian following. The CM while she stared at me. Why did you bite her? Did she seduce you, take the energy out of you until you didn't know what you were doing? Candlestick was under attack and she wanted to talk about Violetta? I love her. I'll always love her. I will never marry another girl. My body and soul aches for her in absolutely every way. She whirled around and left me there. Violetta. Candlestick was under attack. I ran down the hall towards the kitchen and a stream of vampires came towards me. I cut them down at first, but they didn't seem to notice me and I had to get to Violetta. The monster couldn't have her. If he did, I would not rest until I had her back, and I would never let her go again. I slipped through a mass of shuffling zombies, but with more direction than most and armed with knives as well as teeth. The monster was definitely here. I followed my instincts, traveling through the wide halls until I came out in the front hall and stopped abruptly in front of the monster. I barely glanced away from his eyes in time to not look into them, but I'd seen enough in my periphery to know the blood-red fury in them. I threw a knife and leapt towards him, cutting him with my second knife while the first buried itself into his chest. He didn't flinch, simply grabbed me and bit my shoulder, fangs sinking deep into me while he took my blood and flesh. I pulled on the handle of my knife, ripping through his ribcage while I dragged the other one across his neck. He didn't seem to notice, only buried his face deeper into my joint and shoulder, completely ruining my tuxedo. I slashed him again and again, ripping him apart, but the more I killed him, the more he killed me, until the world was dizzy and far away from loss of blood while the hunger couldn't do anything. Would this monster kill me? But I'd never told Violetta that I still loved her and would never stop. Couldn't die. I slashed deeper and faster, struggling to kick and break the monster's hold, but it wasn't until I bit his ear completely off, the blood in my mouth hot and nauseating, that he threw me away from him. I hit the Advent, the beautiful gingerbread masterpiece, and shattered it around me, beneath me, the smell of ginger and molasses barely noticeable for all the blood. The monster was on me again, but I rolled away, bringing down my elbow across his head. I'm sure I hurt my elbow much more than his vampire head, but he reared back anyway, face distended, maw out with massive fangs snapping at me, a hair's breadth from my nose. It pulled back, blinking and struggling to control the wolf. Oh, this was something new. A butcher/vampire/werewolf cannibal. I licked my lips and tasted gingerbread. If I were going to die, it would be with the taste of Violetta's baking in my mouth instead of his blood. I reached back and grabbed a box, one of the last ones, and popped it into my mouth. I'd lost a lot of blood, but it didn't matter, not with whatever had been in that box. Launched myself at him, knocking him into the wall 10 feet away, snapping his head back while his face transformed again into that beast, that entirely uncontrollable monster who wanted Violetta. Things got clear and fuzzy at the same time. We fought in silence except for the thud now and then as he threw me into something or I threw him. I was stronger with every crumb of gingerbread. I ate all the boxes, scooping them up while I wrangled the creature. He growled and hissed, the strangest creature, half fur, half marble, covered in his and my blood, all vicious, out of control violence, but so silent. I found myself on my back, holding onto his mouth, holding the jaws apart with my brute strength while he struggled to close his teeth on my face. What would Beowulf do? I ripped the jaws apart, cracking through his face while he roared in pain and spun away, disappearing through the front door and leaving me with the option to follow the injured monster and end him once and for all, or to save Violetta. I stumbled into a wall before I shook my head, blinking. I put my hand on my neck and shoulder where blood still poured from the wound. I should sit down and put something on that. I stumbled into the same wall before I shook my head, which was somehow supposed to make everything clearer. I staggered down the hall, gaining momentum as I neared the kitchen. I had to find her. I went past a butcher who I patted on the face, leaving him streaked with red before. I made it down into the kitchen, following the trail of blood. Chapter 29. Baker. I baked biscuits, muffins, more muffins, but I went into Landry's powders and started flinging them into whatever I was making, mixing them with no coherent thought to what it would actually do. Call it instinct. Call it apathy. I needed to bake, and I needed to stop thinking about Orion. The feel of his hand on my hand, his palm against my back, finally the one touch I'd been waiting all night for, but he didn't want Violetta. I never should have put on the stupid beautiful soft dress. I'd let myself be vulnerable to them, and like a pack of wolves they descended. My phone rang. I answered. Violetta, are you okay? It was the Greek. I took a shaky breath. No. Everything went wrong and I don't have my hat. Can you bring it over? I'll send Armand. Is he there? He is. He's upset. Keeps pacing and snarling at me. He sniffed like it really hurt his feelings. Yeah, have him come over. I've been baking for him. Loads and loads of muffins. He should feel better after he eats so much he can't move. You've been baking? Good. Then you're not too upset. I half laughed. I'm never too upset for baking. All right. He'll be right over. He hung up and I put it away, focusing on the biscuits and muffins and biscuits and muffins. Seriously, how could anyone eat so many? I had no idea. I did dozens of different varieties, sweet and savory, studded with nuts, fruit, even meat and vegetables. I baked and baked until Armand came in the back door, wiped his boots and nodded at me, my hat in his hand along with my backpack. Come on, all of these are for you, I said, nodding at the racks of baked goods spread over the table. He came forward cautiously before he started gobbling up everything. After a few minutes of ignoring him eat like a barbarian, I felt a rush of exhaustion and sat down suddenly in the middle of rolling out my last batch of biscuits. Armand hesitated before he patted my shoulder, then kind of rubbed it. Then, kind of actually rubbed it like my mother used to do after a meet, and I was so stressed out from all the tension, exhausted and spent. I slumped over the table while he rubbed me, giving me a little bit of energy but not too much. Vanilla, you shouldn't feed me. But I'm your baker. Who else will feed you if I don't? I'm a werewolf. I sighed. That explains the sniffing bits. You should howl more though. I'm serious, Vanilla. I'm a werewolf. That's why I'm dead to Orion and my mother. It's dangerous for you to be with me. I turned my head so I could look at him, the broad jaw and the sharp cheekbones, the eyes that were usually haunted but not usually quite so sad. Are you going to eat me? He hesitated. I could infect you. I stared at him for a long time before I sat up. Are you serious? He shrugged. At the moment. Are you kidding me? He frowned. You want me to shift? Yes. He sighed and got up, shaking out his shoulders a little bit before the house shook, the kitchen walls bowing in as if from a giant pressure before they straightened up. I stood up, rolling pin in one hand, cleaver in the other. Armand scowled at me. Put down the weapons, Vanilla. Run upstairs. Bolt yourself in. You'll be safe in the tower. The kitchen door opened and a man entered, long blonde hair sweeping forward over his cheekbones. He wore a tuxedo and looked beautiful, the most handsome man I'd ever seen, and that was before he looked at me with those red-tinged eyes. I screamed and threw the cleaver at him. He caught it in his forearm but took it out and tossed it to the side. Armand and the baker. This is my lucky day. Armand growled, showing his teeth while his jaw grew and sprouted vicious fangs. His hands stayed human, but had knives in them that he used viciously on the creature. I backed away from their fight because I was a baker, not a butcher or a werewolf or whatever that monster was. It had a human face one moment and an animal's muzzle the next, but it wasn't quite canine. I ran for the exit, but Armand crashed into me, taking me to the ground, ripping my pants and banging my head. He rolled off, leaving long strands of saliva over my face while I struggled up, trying for the tower door, but the monster was in front of it, clearly aware of where I'd been headed. I grabbed a pan off the table and threw it at him, another skillet, every hard metal thing I could grab, and some rolls and biscuits too, while Armand ripped at him with his jaws, sliced him up with his knives, but didn't seem to do nearly enough damage. The monster was simply too powerful. I was definitely going to die. Vanilla, get in Landry's storage room. Armand growled through a mouthful of teeth. The entry to the storage room was closer to me than the monster, but he started moving, a blur that would rip me apart. I jumped up, pushed off the edge of the table, pushed off the wall with my hands and rolled into the spices room, landing kind of badly but far enough in the room that when an iron grate fell from the ceiling and stabbed into the stone floor, I wasn't skewered. I rolled to my feet while the monster hit the grill, the thick metal, impervious to its deadly curved claws and fangs, which he spent a second sharpening on the grill. I went to the powders and found something that made my eyes water and blew it into his face. He fell back coughing and Armand landed on him, sinking his fangs deep in his throat. They went down, rolling. I had hoped that Armand would kick the monster's tail, not that he seemed to have a tail while Armand probably had one. Not that I could see. Armand kept his pants on. Armand was a werewolf. That explained why he was their ambassador to butchers, but it didn't explain why no one had mentioned it. Take him down, Armand. Bite his head off. Armand ripped out a large chunk of its throat, but then the thing smashed Armand down again and again and again into the stone floor before it buried its face into Armand's stomach. After a moment I turned away because I couldn't watch the creature eating Armand's intestines. I barely noticed that I was crying while I stood there, trying to think. The creature hit the bars, face dripping Armand's blood and other things. He licked the bars slow while his red eyes burned into mine. I looked away, but it didn't seem like he was in control of himself enough to control me. Hopefully. I can taste you on him, inside of him. You really are his baker. If you can adapt to a monster like Armand, you'll adapt to me. I will come for you. Again, Vanilla, but first I have a butcher to kill. He whirled around and left the kitchen, stepping over Armand's still body like it wasn't there. After he'd gone, I shook the bars, at least I tried to, but they were solid. There was no way I could ever get them up on my own. I screamed, I cried. But it was no use until Landry came into the kitchen, running towards me, avoiding the fallen pots and pans until he reached me. Violetta, are you okay? I nodded, but my hands were shaking and tears were rolling down my face. Snuffled loudly. He killed Armand. Werewolves are hard to kill. Stubborn butchers like Armand are even tougher. There's a lever behind the bag of potatoes. Go and pull it up as hard as you can. I blinked at him stupidly before I fumbled to the potatoes, groping around on the wall behind the things until I found the lever. I pulled it up, but nothing happened. As hard as you can, Violetta. He needs you. What could I do? If I could save Orion with Jello, maybe I could save Armand. I yanked on it, ripping the ligaments in my shoulder, but it didn't matter. I wasn't a real gymnast anymore. Nothing mattered more than saving the life of my friend, grumpy, annoying, ridiculous Armand. I had to make him all better, so I could beat him up for lying to me. I hurried over to the grill as it rose slowly, then ducked under, slicing my back on the sharp spike, but it wasn't bad enough to worry about. I ran over to Armand and stared at the mess of him. His jaw seemed to be off completely. And his stomach, what was left of his stomach, it wasn't good. Landry put a knife on the table that had been Armand's before he bent and began tying his hands and feet behind him with aprons. What are you doing? He glanced at me. This is going to hurt him, and he's going to move a lot. The more he moves, the more it hurts and the slower it heals. Grab me another apron. I brought the apron, but before I could kneel beside him, he had me fetching powders and potions from the cupboard by the kitchen sink. I didn't think there was any point because Armand wasn't moving, he'd lost too much blood and he was missing half of his stomach, but I kept bringing things, and then once they were all together I knew what I had to do. Tapioca pudding. I whipped it together, boiling water, while Landry worked on the physical patching of the wolfman's wounds. Landry jabbed something deep in its belly and it screamed, the monster's mouth stretching while the trousers finally vanished in a puff of fur and clawed feet. Landry stepped back while the now fully enormous wolf twisted and writhed on the floor, and I mixed my tapioca pudding with a blend of powders that would make him all better. Finally, it was the right consistency, and though hot, I would pour it down his throat. I wasn't sure how I was going to do that without getting bitten. Didn't want to turn into a werewolf. I had a hard enough time being a baker. Can you hold his head down? I need to feed him. Get the long metal ladle above the fireplace. He won't break it. The process of scooping the tapioca pudding into the werewolf's snarling mouth was tedious and lengthy since most of it dripped down its fur, often landing in the icky bits I didn't want to acknowledge. But finally his stomach started stitching itself together. I watched in amazement while Armand twisted and howled, only the incredibly strong baker aprons holding him down. That's it then, Landry said, letting go of Armand and scrambling back, dragging me with him. The wolf snapped and growled, tried to lick its wounds but couldn't reach very well the way it was tied. Landry put a hand on my head. Violetta, I have to go back into the ballroom. If something comes in, go into the storage room. Pull the lever down. Understand? I nodded and he dashed off, leaving me with an injured werewolf who wasn't dead. I felt so empty. I walked around the kitchen exhausted, picking up rolls and biscuits and tossing them to the werewolf. It was filthy, covered in dirt and blood. Who knew what else? Had he ever taken a bath? I dropped into the wingback chair, terribly empty. Whatever I'd put into that tapioca had taken it out of me. It was like after the jello, only it was working with Armand's energy, which was far less satisfying than Orion's. I curled up and put my head on the arm, letting myself drift off until pounding of footsteps brought me awake. I looked up and saw Orion burst into the kitchen, down the few steps to stop and stare at the basically demolished kitchen, the werewolf tied up on the floor and me curled up in the chair, dressed as Cesario. He came to me, dropped to his knees in front of me and pulled me into his arms, burying his face in my chest. That woke me up and then I slid my fingers through his hair to push him away from me, but somehow I was holding him tight and brushing the back of his neck, drawing in his energy, his life, bit by bit until I slowly felt like I might be able to clean the kitchen before I went to bed. I ran my fingers over his shoulder and realized that his jacket was damp, very damp, and when I prodded further, I found the wound in his shoulder. I pushed him away and stood up, glaring down at him. You're hurt. His eyes widened. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to get blood on your shirt. He reached out and brushed my chest, which made me gasp and made his eyes widen. I'm sorry, he repeated, but I only pushed him away and went to the table, where the powders were still laid out. I didn't know what to do. All I felt like doing was going back to him and holding him, making sure he held me until the world was right again. I wiped the back of my hand over my face and sniffed. Orion, you need to hold me now. Not for me, but for the exchange. I need your energy as quickly and as efficiently as possible, so I'm going to. He cut me off, cupping my face and kissing me, his lips soft, hungry, aching against mine. I sighed and fell into that kiss, wrapping my arms around him and holding him tightly while his strength filled me in a rush that I never wanted to end. For a flash, I felt his teeth against my lips, but I drew deeper from him and he promptly melted into a boneless heap on the floor. I stood there, reeling from his energy but also clear-headed or something like that. I needed his energy, so now I needed to bake. I wanted to help Orion, but somehow I knew that he would be fine without any baked goods. All he needed was rest and time, which is what he'd get. I left him on the floor and baked, stepping over the werewolf and the butcher as I created cakes and cookies of a dizzying variety, my hands a blur as I moved without the slightest hesitation or doubt. Time passed while I baked until I was staring at stacks of baked goods and the room was getting fuzzy. I put my hands on the table and struggled to stay upright, but I was out of fuel. I needed to rest, and that meant climbing each and every one of the steps up to my tower. I took a deep breath and tried to get up, bone-weary and aching, my head throbbing with every step. The table would have to do. When I tenderly ran my hands over the back of my head, I felt the rising bump and I remembered the floor. I also had a bunch of new scrapes and cuts on my hands and arms. I looked up and finally noticed Landry moving around the kitchen, handing out my baked goods in eerie silence to the row of waiting butcher's boys who watched me with eyes full of something strange I didn't want to worry about. Somehow found the energy to leave the room and make it up the stairs. I opened my door and pulled off my suspenders before I crashed onto my bed. The thing was, someone else was already there. For a second I froze and thought of the monster, but I knew that strength and warm perfection. I knew him and loved him with every fiber of my being. Instead of waking him up and kicking him out of bed, I wrapped my arms around him and snuggled into him as deeply as I could, breathing Orion as I fell asleep. Chapter 30. Butcher. I woke up in heaven. Usually if I wake up after losing consciousness, a wraith is gnawing on me. Hate wraiths. It was so much more pleasant to have Violetta's head on my chest, her hand curled against my neck, a few strands of my hair tangled in her fingers. I woke up hungry, of course starving, but I wasn't in any hurry to bite Violetta. It would be too rude to wake her up after she'd had such an exhausting night. I studied her, the lines of her soft cheek and the curve of Her sweet lips, the billowy white baker's shirt ripped and stained with streaks of her blood over her back, the way she held me tighter when a shadow crept across her brow, as though I would keep the nightmares away. I moved my hand to hold her and realized my hand was full. Tablets. Landry must have prepared me for waking up with my love. I swallowed them, trying to do so motionlessly, which was a lot harder than I'd thought. After that I could breathe without my mouth watering for her, but I still ached to pull her close, to wrap my arms around her. That was my project, putting my arms around her without waking her up. I moved little by little the arm that was underneath her until I had it around her back, and then I wrapped my other arm carefully until she was laying on me completely in my arms, as she should be. I closed my eyes and held her, perfectly content for the first time in weeks. I told my mother that I would marry Violetta or no one. I'd meant it. But more, I didn't want no one. I wanted her, and I had lost the motivation to stay away. She should be at my side so I could protect her and not race through the halls searching for her, terrified that I'd find her broken body sprawled across the floor or gone at the mercy of a monster. Protecting her for an ideal future of some kind wasn't any good if I couldn't save her now. Could I save her? Butchers didn't save, they executed. I was changing though, becoming more than that. I had fear, I had feeling, but Violetta was my heart, my home, and however much I feared hurting her, becoming part of her life only to have her turn away from me later when she realized how unworthy I was, it was inconceivable that I not try, couldn't continue to go against every feeling, impulse, and instinct that drew her to me. She was my fate, my life, and I would keep her in my arms as long as she would let me. She stirred, my name on her lips. I tightened my grip on her and she moved. Again, her legs shifting against mine, toes brushing my skin. She opened her eyes and smiled at me, for another moment soft and relaxed before she sat up, eyes wide and alarmed. Orion, why are you in my bed? I smiled. I have no idea. Maybe it's a hallucination. Mine or yours? I considered for a moment. Probably mine. I've been wanting to wake up in your bed ever since All Saints' Day. She stared at me, her eyes falling to my lips for a moment, her own lips parting before she pressed them together in a firm line. Yes, this is a lot. Like that morning, at least last night was equally horrific. She scowled at me suddenly. Armand is a werewolf. Why didn't you tell me? I wouldn't have run around with him like a completely oblivious idiot if you had. I wanted so much to pull her back down against me, snuggle her under my chin, and put off words for a little while longer. He's not much more dangerous than I am. If he bites you, you might turn, but you might not. He hasn't bitten you while I did. She shifted and glanced down at her arm. Beneath the white shirt sleeve was a mark my mother had noticed immediately. She considered it a dire sign, and she wasn't wrong. I was desperately addicted to Violetta. Even if I could happily go without biting her for the rest of my life, I couldn't go without this. Finally talking to her, holding her, being more than her butcher. She swallowed. I was so afraid of werewolves, but they aren't all monsters. Is that what you wanted me to realize? He stared at her. I love you. That's the only thing I need you to know. She stared at me for a long time, emotions rising beneath the surface, anger and fear, but also hope. I loved seeing that hope in her eyes, that she might someday come to trust me, that I would protect her heart with as much determination as I protected the rest of her. She sighed. Orion, we've been doing so well as butcher/baker without anything else complicating things. Have we? Is that why you watch me work in the forge, because you feel nothing else? She tried to pull away, but my arms wouldn't let her. She pushed against me before she suddenly collapsed on me and pressed her face into my chest. You weren't supposed to notice me. I always notice you. No matter the clothes you wear, it's always my sweet Violetta underneath. It always will be. She shook her head but didn't take it off my beating heart. You didn't act like it. That's because we were acting. I really did try, because I wanted to protect you, to keep you safe from me, the pain I might cause you, but I can't protect you from myself and the rest of the world at the same time. Seems to me that the rest of the world is even more dangerous to you than I am. She lifted her head to stare at me. Really? You just noticed that? I was hanging out with a werewolf and didn't know it. Orion, we can't just go back to the way we were before. I nodded. I agree. That's why I think you should marry me. She gasped and my stomach twisted. I'd really said that. Out loud. She pulled away and I let her, but I followed, sitting up and touching her face, careful, afraid that I'd scare her away again. I don't know whether to slap you or stab you, or kiss you and suck the life out of you. Are you going to tell me that you never want to see me again later? Today. I pretended to consider it as I stroked her cheek with my fingers. That's not on my schedule. She scowled at me, the ridiculously adorable scowl that I wanted to wake up to for the rest of my life. What is on your schedule? Well, I said slowly, I need to be in the Cavern of Seals by noon so your brother and Anthony can bleed on the seals. Make certain it breaks immediately. We could get married any time in between those things. She stared at me, her mouth open. You're mental. You don't fit marriage in between bleeding on seals and Massachusetts. There should be, I don't know, invitations, a nice dress, flowers, cake, dancing, that kind of thing. I raised my eyebrows. You'd like a traditional wedding? All right, anything. For you, my love. I leaned close to kiss her, but she put her hand on my chest, holding me back with her delicate touch. I did enjoy her hand on my chest, even if it was to keep me away. This must be part of your transition, the completely idiotically, insanely, stupidly romantic personality. How long will it last? Forever. She snickered. Now you're telling me that you're an immortal vampire? Finally understand the coat. I sighed and bumped her forehead with mine. I'm so glad that things make sense for you. Can I kiss you? Why? Her eyes got enormous, lips soft, and she glanced down at my own mouth, which I curved into a smile. I haven't kissed you for hours. She licked her lips and pressed down with her teeth. That shouldn't have happened. I'm perfectly capable of taking your energy without resorting to kisses. And you're perfectly capable of resisting my energy in spite of my kisses. Yes. Some days you barely take anything at all from me. It's such torture. She rolled her eyes. You're so dramatic. You're not usually like that. I stared at her steadily until she finally looked back at me, staring deeply into my eyes. I'm serious. I can protect you better if you're close to me. May not be able to protect you from myself, but with last night losing control in the ball completely when I saw you with Armand, clearly I can't do that anyway. You will be safe with me, at least from everything else, but I can't guarantee that I won't bring you pain. She grabbed my wrists and pulled them away from her face while she sat up and leaned away from me until she wasn't touching me at all. I can handle a little bit of pain, but the thing is your original reasons are still valid. It's dangerous for us to be together. It's taboo for a reason. I don't want to be with you when your mother is constantly following me around, waiting for me to mess up. I don't want to be like my mother, looked down on by the Vespettis because of what she was. I'm not a love conquers all kind of person. I got swept up by the whole thing, but I've had time to realize that while I respect you like you, and would love to have you as my butcher, I'm not sure if anything else will ever be in the cards for me. I'm genuinely happy being Cesario, just baking and hanging with you. It would be a little nicer if it weren't kind of tense between us, but I think in time it'll settle down. I'll be your Landry, and you'll be my CM. I stared at her while my heart ached and my stomach knotted. She looked so honest, so clear and reasonable. All right. I'll only ask you to marry me twice a day. She exhaled and shook her head. Orion, I just told you that. You want me to be your butcher and nothing more, but the thing is, you're lying. It's okay. I don't mind. You can lie as much as you like because I know your heart. You told me that you loved me. You would not have changed your mind or your heart so easily. You are constant, true, and loyal. When you've decided that I've suffered long enough, you will ask me to kiss you and never stop. She raised her eyebrows. Such confidence. In you, I will always have perfect faith. She inhaled shakily while her eyes filled with tears. Orion, this won't work. I can't let you mess with my heart like this. Until you've finished your transition, you don't know what it is that you want or who you are. I studied her. That's fair. Are you hungry? She nodded. I'm starving. She bit her bottom lip. I'm surprised that you didn't bite me. Landry put pills in my hand. He must have put me here last night instead of leaving me on the kitchen floor. He doesn't like things cluttering up his kitchen. She smiled slightly. That's what you do, clutter up my heart. I took her hand and pressed a kiss to the back of it. If you'd rather I clutter up your bed. She laughed and shook her head, pulling her hand away. You shouldn't touch me. Before you've eaten. I want to take so much of your energy and you don't have much. I bake so much but I have no idea why. I stared at her. There were a lot of civilians at the ball last night. Butchers can usually take care of themselves, but those excellent families without current butchers are incredibly vulnerable. I would bet that your baking saved the injured who could not heal as easily as me. She took that as an invitation to rip open my shirt and examine my shoulder, neck and chest. She ran her fingers over my wounds and I wished desperately that I had more of them. This is still pretty bad. He took a lot of your flesh. He ate it. She winced. He was so beautiful, even more perfect than you. I laughed. What a thing to say about a butcher. You looked very beautiful last night. She frowned slightly. Thank you. I shouldn't have chosen a backless dress. Gave butchers the wrong idea. I raised an eyebrow. You have a very beautiful back. I noticed a cut on it. Did you put something on it? I'd hate for it to get infected. I offer my services of kissing it better. She gasped and looked at me with those incredible eyes, vulnerable and soft. Before she shook her head sternly. Don't tempt me. You have to prove yourself constant before you kiss me again. I smiled widely. Really? Thank you. She looked surprised and worried. Wait a minute, Orion. I don't think you took that the right way. I pulled her into a hug. For a moment her body soft against mine, her arms wrapping around me to hold me close while I tucked her head beneath my chin. Violetta, I will prove anything you like if you only give me another chance. She sighed against me and snuggled her face against my neck, her breath sending goosebumps over my skin. I'm beginning to think that you're very persistent. I have to take after my mother some way. She let me hold her for almost half an hour before my growling stomach interrupted us for the final time. She got up and opened the door, pointing me out. Cesario has to get dressed. Can I help you with your back? I'll get Landry. Go on, Orion. You need to eat so that I can take your strength. That motivated me. I headed down the stairs feeling lighter than I had in weeks. Hungrier too. In the kitchen, everyone turned to stare at me. Landry, 2 other bakers, a handful of butcher's boys and my mother. What was she doing here? Morning. I need breakfast. Landry had already started moving before I finished talking. He set a plate and started me with crescent rolls and cold beef while he put on a skillet with eggs and potatoes. Where's Cesario? Landry asked. Changing. He has a cut on his back that you should look at. Landry nodded. He did good last night. I've never seen anything like that. The focus and intensity stepping over you like you weren't there, it was a little bit terrifying. But the baked goods were miraculous. I nodded because I hadn't expected any less. Any casualties? Landry glanced over at my mother where she stood quietly, watching and listening to our exchange. No. No deaths and every injury was cured by your baker. I exhaled while a wave of frustrated longing swept through me. If I hadn't had the visions, let the fear consume me, I would have her openly with me, my baker, my love. I should tell my mother now that Violetta was Cesario, that she was so brilliant I would never be worthy of her. My mother walked towards me, waiting until after I'd eaten for a solid 10 minutes. Where is the girl? I sighed. Violetta? Why do you want to know? She frowned. Orion, if she is the only girl that you are willing to marry, then I should discuss the prospect with her. I swallowed and stared at her in utter shock. You will not oppose it? She cocked her head in what was almost assent, but I didn't trust it. You have decided. I have. I stood staring her down. I was not a child, eager to show her my new skills when she bothered coming home a few times a year. I would make this work with Violetta, and no one and nothing was going to stand in my way. K-12. If you'd like to sign up for my email list to hear news on my exciting books, go here. http://julianwickerwriter.blogspot.com/p/subscribe-to-release-announcement-email.html. If you made it this far, why not leave a review? Reviews are incredibly helpful to indie authors like me. If you have comments, questions, or just want to chat, you can find me. Twitter, Facebook, Amazon author page. http://www.amazon.com/julian-
Wicker/B004-74-8-8-8
I also have a crazy Facebook group that's kind of weird. Here. Julian Wickers. Secret Society. The next book in Butcher, Baker, Vampire Slayer series will come out October 2018.